I just want to welcome everyone to this webinar hosted by ASPA's section on democracy and social justice. And this webinar is the 6th in our section series on dismantling white supremacy in public service organizations and society. And this particular webinar will focus on emergency management and disaster preparedness. My name is Sean and I serve as chair of the section. And this event is being recorded and we posted on our YouTube channel and shared over our social media outlets after the event. And I'm going to be remaining off camera for the duration of this event, which just makes editing the video easier. But before getting started, we'd like to let everyone know about 2 special issues that our section is sponsoring, 2 special issues in journals. And we have the links that we just sent through the chat. The first is an administrative theory and praxis and is a companion series to this very webinar series on dismantling white supremacy. And the lead editor for that special issue is going to be Dr. Brandy Blessett, who is also a member of the DSJ board. The second is in public integrity and is a companion issue to our section's ethics series. And as you see, we have the Taylor and Francis page right there. And we're privileged to be joined today by Dr. Richard Gregory Johnson, who is one of the past chairs of DSJ and also one of the editors on the series. And Dr. Johnson, I believe you should be able to take yourself off mute if you'd like to make any comments about the special issue or DSJ's web series.
Yes, good morning, Dr. McCandless and my dear colleagues. It's indeed an honor for me to address you this morning very briefly. We are excited about this public integrity journal symposium that's coming out. I believe that Dr. McCandless has already posted that in the chat. If you're interested in submitting a proposal, brief proposal, you're welcome to contact me directly or just follow the directions in the prospectus, and then we will gladly take a look at what you've submitted. We're also very pleased to let everyone know that the special issue of PAR that Susan Gooded and Jade Berry and I we served as the lead editors. And that will be coming out probably in a couple months or so. And so that's something to look forward to as well. So thank you, Dr. McCandless, for allowing me to speak, and wishing everyone a great panel, as I know that it will be.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Really appreciate that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with our event. So we're proud to be joined today by 6 amazing panelists. We have Dr. Dontá Council of American University and the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Dr. Claire Connolly Knox of the University of Central Florida, Senior Advisor Antoine B. Richards of the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, Dr. Jason Rivera of SUNY Buffalo State College, Professor Kira Rogers of Millikan University, and Dr. Henry Smart III of John Jay College of Criminal Justice in CUNY. And we sent you a link earlier, and it's a link to a statement that Dr. Susan Goodin has made, in which she says that we're currently experiencing a dual pandemic of COVID-19 and racism. And as disasters and emergencies become all the more common for a multitude of reasons, the need to acknowledge, understand, and dismantle injustices like racism and white supremacy, and also create just solutions are all the more acute. So just a little bit about logistics. We're going to be starting with 3 general open-ended questions for our panelists. And panelists, please feel free to answer in whatever order you want, and we can have follow-ups. You can ask questions of other panelists, just really just make it as dynamic as possible. And so these questions that we're going to be asking are broad, and they're really based on this idea that each panelist can approach answering the questions as they see fit. And then after this discussion, we're going to open the floor to audience Q&A. We're trying something new about having an externally linked form for people to ask questions and raise comments. So I'm going to just go ahead and stop my screen share, and I'm going to get going with the first question, and it's also in the chat, and it's this. How and why do racism and white supremacy manifest in emergency management and disaster preparedness? Dr. Rivera, do you want to go first since you took yourself off mute?
I was waiting for somebody to jump in, right? So it's interesting to me because when I hear the term white supremacy, what comes to my mind is an overt, tactful way that organizations or people are attempting to whitewash policy or practices or the way in which minorities are able to interface with government systems and their mechanisms for oppressing and marginalizing those communities to gain resources. And so when I think about that, I really am thinking within the realm of emergency management, disaster recovery. For me, white supremacy really comes in the form of the social construction of populations. For me, when disasters happen, or when we're leading up to the disaster, or when we're planning for disasters, we have a narrative that's being created by media, by political agents, by local authorities that are attempting to situate minority populations, particularly African American and Latino populations, as deserving or not deserving of response resources or recovery aid, based on some notion that we are at fault for our vulnerability to emergency events, to disaster, or some types of emergency agents. And you see, and although this is a historic thing that we've seen across time, I think over the last 4 years, it's become very prevalent, at least very prevalent in that it's been more exercised by political agents in the face of people at the federal level. We saw a lot of the social construction of minority populations, whether or not they were deserving of aid with Katrina, right? We saw mass media trying to depict African-American communities as undeserving because in New Orleans and Louisiana, because they were rioting, they were stealing, they were taking things from people, they were having these very atrocious stories of what happened at the Superdome, which were there, but not there. The exaggeration, the dramatization played into the ability of policymakers to a certain extent, in the very beginning, reduce and prioritize the reaction to the event. And more recently, we've seen this with Puerto Rico, right? This notion that Puerto Ricans were not deserving of aid because of some type of actions that the island or the people that run the island participated or not participated in, to disallow them from gaining aid, to allow them to the notion that we are not deserving of aid because of our situation, because of our lack of or the lack of ability to enhance or contribute to various aspects of the electoral cycle. And so this notion of the social construction of populations, although it's something that happens across all policy areas, I admittedly. However, within the realm of emergency management and disaster recovery, this greatly and immediately affects the lives of individuals, the lives of communities, and the lives of regions within this country. The other way I see this manifested, and then I'll be quiet, is in the lack of diversity in the subcontracting and in the RFPs that go out by Homeland Security and FEMA, that do not place a minimum level of diversity from the contracting agencies that they deal with. Across the board, we typically have this notion, we have this conversation of using organizations or using a certain percentage of minority and women-owned businesses to do the work of government, right? But within EM, within FEMA, there seems to be a lack of mandate within these RFPs that might somehow diversify the agents and the gatekeepers to aid in the aftermath of disaster, because these people, or the lack of diversity within these subcontractors, the ones doing the home inspections, for example, these are the gatekeepers to aid for individuals and for families. Without diversity, without empathy, without someone being able to even talk to you because you don't know your own language that when they come to your home, this greatly affects not only the recovery of social groups within our society, but this also perpetuates the advantage of certain communities within our society as well.
Great response. Professor Richards,
this is Dante.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, my apologies.
No, so yeah, so I'll take a stab at this, and thanks, Jason, for really kind of setting the foundation to think about some of this socio-historical context of emergency management and kind of the formulation of race. And so I'm going to actually just share my screen very quickly and just talk about this maybe from a wealth standpoint. And so part of what I think is important to think about is when we think about white supremacy, I think that it truly is, and Derek Hamilton kind of says it's the best, it's the pre-existing condition that really creates, promotes, and facilitates the preservation of whiteness, really within the Americas. And so this really manifests through what we call the racial wealth gap, right? And so wealth is really this measure of an accumulation of all of your assets. And so when we think about wealth, wealth is primarily accumulated through 4 different types of approaches: income and wages, and so our regular jobs, and returns on investments. And so when we think about things like home equity or stocks, intergenerational transfers of assets, and so that's when assets are passed off to relatives, and then access to credit. And so these are the primary ways that we accumulate wealth. However, we do still see a racial wealth gap. And so the racial wealth gap is what I would think is one of the most striking, some of the most striking evidence, really, of the legacy of chattel slavery, discrimination, and really what I would say is America's hatred towards Black people and people of color. And so we've seen this through really policy design. And so a couple of examples are when we think about public housing. Public housing was really designed to benefit poor white people so that they could have transitional housing. However, that narrative has drastically changed into things like the welfare queen, right? And so we see these social constructions and these narratives change, and then we see how this manifests primarily through the racial wealth gap. And so just to kind of set the stage a little bit when we think about the racial wealth gap, using the 2016 Survey of Consumer Finances, this 33-year period pretty much shows how wealth has changed from 1983 to 2016. And so what we pretty much see here is that white growth, the wealth for white folks has really grown over the last 33 years. And so on average, white folks have seen an average of $36,000 increase in their wealth over the last 33 years, while Black folks have seen a decrease of an average of $3,700 and respectively $2,300 for Latino folks. And so the argument really is that there's a huge racial gap, but we depend on wealth to really navigate what we call these shocks and stresses throughout our communities, and disasters being one of them. And so some of the more recent research that we've seen from Howe and Elliott really kind of highlights the impacts of health inequities across the U.S. And so they take a deep dive at analyzing trends at the county level to really look at wealth data, and then also the reported amounts of damages by county, and also the reported wealth by county. And so what they really do is, over time, they really hypothesize 2 different things. One, that over time, damages from natural hazards influence wealth trajectories unequally. And then 2, when federal assistance is given to an area by FEMA, that also influences wealth trajectories, I should say, wealth trajectories in an unequal fashion. And so really to kind of think through some of these key findings. And so the first finding really out of this study is that as reported damages increases by the county, so does county level wealth. And so that's a huge finding, but also expected. One of the more interesting findings is that while wealth increases for counties with higher reported damage, the relationship between reported damages and wealth is statistically significant for whites. And so this really suggests that while county wealth may increase, only whites really benefit from disasters. And so we see that there's an increase in wealth for whites, but not for Blacks and Latinos. And really this third finding is that homeowners gain more wealth than renters when reported damage increases at the county level. And so that's really expected as well, right? Your home is an asset. It's something that you can build equity with. It's something that most families use to build assets, to build wealth in their families. And so these findings were really, really interesting because it gave us kind of a deeper look as to how do natural hazards and disasters really affect the way that we think about wealth in the United States. And so, I'll kind of leave it here, but I have some thoughts around the kind of long-term recovery, whose position in society to really gain from these types of impacts, but also how FEMA assistance isn't equitable. And so I think Jason hit a little bit on that, but I'm going to also pass the floor off to my other colleagues so they can share as well.
Really, really excellent information. Thank you.
I'll go next. If Antoine, did you want to chime in before I start?
No, feel free. I'll hop on after you.
Okay. So I'm more of the brainiac of thinking about concepts. And so in preparation for today's conversation, I thought about white supremacy and what's the counter to that. So I'm going to share a few dichotomies with you here. So when I tie white supremacy, I tie it to being competitive versus compassionate, being ego driven versus being heart centered, and operating out of fear versus love. That's something we don't hear in public administration too much, but we should. And thinking about numbers versus humans and the needs attached to those humans. So when we get to the question of how does racism and white supremacy continue to proliferate disaster management community, we know at the broader community, it's a problem because we've moved away from these human factors that have turned everything into an extension to a computer, right? So we know all of those things that Dr. Rivera and Dr. Council have shared with us here, that there's these pre-existing conditions, but we can deal with this problem on a one-to-one basis when we're interacting with folks in the field and throughout academia. The things I just described to you, you see the ugliness in academia, but you also see it in the field of practice, and that's why we're having trouble trying to get a hold of the reins. We got to get people back to this sort of moral compass that sees everyone worth saving. The first point is we are dealing with a continual deterioration of our collective moral compass. And until we have that sort of reckoning, we're going to continue to have these type of conversations and pointing out the flaws and the poor outcomes on a continual basis. So we got to fix the humans that are involved in this, mostly the decision makers. The second piece is the actors, right? So fixing the folks who currently make decisions that will impact marginalized communities. Now, how do we fix them? Paper I've been playing around with now for the past 2 years. Let's think about it in terms of political actors, and let's use the president, for example. If a particular state has given electoral votes to a president, that president, just being a natural person, may show favoritism to that state in times of crisis. How do we prevent that? Because right now we don't have mechanisms or programs or any type of body in place to go back and check the accountability of the president in times of crisis. Did he or she make the right decision? And was there favoritism? Was there cronyism? And so I would charge, and I'll save some of this for later in our discussion, government entities to think about those loose radical actors in the government. So I'll stop here and pass the baton on to Mr. Richards.
Great comments. Thank you.
Excellent. And I think it's important to understand, or at least for me, when I thought about this question and, manifestation is kind of like, hey, something has become clear or it's become obvious or it's, becoming obvious to us over time. And I can't necessarily say that I feel that racism and white supremacy have fully manifested themselves in emergency management. I think it's clear among a lot of people that racism and white supremacy do exist. And I think it's also unclear for a lot of people. And we see that with the outcomes of Hurricane Katrina, which we started to see a lot about vulnerability and disparity research, but that was 2005, and then we look at the 1995 Chicago heat wave where 739 Black people died and their bodies were thrown in the freezer trucks and just a horrible story there. And then we fast forward to now 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic, and we hear similar stories, increased Black death, increased people thrown in the freezer trucks in the beginning. So there's obvious disparities, and there always have been. And I think if you haven't seen them to this point, you're blind. You hear a lot that people are coming out and saying, you know what, we're finally seeing these disparities, but they've always existed. And a lot of this is rooted in our social system, even down to the Constitution, which, started out that all men are created equal, but didn't really focus on women and definitely didn't consider people of color. So when you think about it in that context, every policy that was built thereafter, which was foundationally rooted in the Constitution, was rooted in inequity. And so is emergency management. A lot of the policies that we deal with in emergency management are also rooted in inequity. When you think about the redlining and the ability to explore vulnerabilities, or a lack of reference to equity at all levels. Actually, for a recent project, I looked at all of the emergency management policies that are in place now. So the Stafford Act, and a few more, and none of them mentioned equity. And if they did mention equity, they mentioned it in the term of housing, meaning that you could use the equity from your housing as a line of credit or so to really help with your recovery or your resilience, which doesn't affect people of color in a lot of ways. And I think the big problem is that many of us have grown so accustomed to this centuries old system that it makes it truly hard to realize that systemic complexities exist. I'll be, kind of the first to admit that I've always had difficulty addressing white supremacy or just saying it out loud. And the reason being is because there's so much hate, determined around that term, white supremacy. We think about, I grew up in the South, so when I hear it, I think, the Klan, or you think a lot of these race groups or things. But I began to think more as a researcher and a public health practitioner that when we look at data epidemiologically, such as morbidity and mortality, everything is compared to whites. So when we take into effect COVID-19, they say, hey, Blacks are 2.1 times more likely to die from COVID-19 compared to whites. American Indians and Alaskan Natives are 5.3 times more likely to be hospitalized because of COVID-19 compared to whites. It's the same thing for cancer, it's the same thing for heart disease, it's the same thing for diabetes. Everything is often compared to whites. And I think the point that I'm really making here is that until we get to a point where we can just say people die from cancer and not an inequitable burden of people dying from cancer that is always compared to whites, then it's going to be really difficult to get beyond the white supremacy conversation or saying that it does exist. And I think we have to accept that it does exist beyond just being tied to hate groups or terrorist groups, but that everything we do is compared to whites as a historic control group. And we have to start to move past that. And even when you look at that data, we understand that Blacks are more likely to die in disasters or because of cancer or diabetes. And we have basically deemed those acceptable losses. Well, anything more than the 2 times of Black people that die are excess deaths. But the problem with that is there's still an inequitable burden there. So we can't just write out the acceptable losses, the 2 times more people that die because of that. And a lot of this is rooted in the policies that are present. And until we can fix the policies and really build up upon the root causes of vulnerability, it's going to be really hard to get past that. So I'm going to stop there and pass it on.
Awesome, thank you.
Excellent responses.
Yeah, very good responses. I'm learning a lot too as I'm listening to everybody, because it's just kind of great to have these conversations, So I actually come from, so again, my name is Kira Rogers. I live in Decatur, Illinois, and so right here in the smack dab middle of central Illinois. And we've been having a lot of conversations at the government level, really just about, the pandemic and how it's even affected, jails and prisons and the responses to how do you really work with those situations, right? As people are, everybody is susceptible to contracting COVID, right? Everybody is. And the thing is, the responses though, from our governments, the responses from, even our leaders that work in the court systems, the responses were hesitation in terms of what to really do with most of the people in the jails and the prisons. They're at risk as well. Do you just let everybody out? No. But what was the absolute way to really work with folks to try to make sure they weren't spreading the virus within the jails and prisons? And so majority of people in the jails and prisons, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, they are mostly Black and brown people. And most of them are nonviolent offenders. And so the thing is, what do you do about that, right? Are you able to actually let people out of the jails and prisons? And then do you run the risk of actually having them to spread the virus when they return home? Some of them have no homes to return to. So how do we really work these things out? And so I bring that up to say this, it's really that a lot of the systems that really govern the way the courts operate, the way the systems operate, they too were deeply rooted in the white supremacists, the white supremacist systems. This is where, people have struggled, even professionals, they have struggled, like yourself, Antoine, you just mentioned this. Those of us that work in the court system, we thought we were doing the right things, right? As far as like, actually carrying out a lot of these laws. But when you actually do some homework and you do some research, and some of my own students, they ask me, how do you feel about the death penalty? Well, I give them a straight answer. I don't really feel too good about it. Here's why, because I know who it was actually created for. And so that being said, I think that even with the jails and prisons, we have to find ways to do business a little differently. Do you honestly, do we honestly need to throw people, in those systems for as long as we do? And again, to your point again, Antoine, we compare them to how long People have been thrown in jail and prison for, for things that they've done, and it's always compared to their white counterparts. Similar cases, but again, the comparison has always been to whites. So again, the social justice movements and the groups and everybody that have been talking now, it's not that this stuff has ever been new. It's just that now we have people who are willing to listen, and people are willing to talk more and actually, discuss these things. So again, I appreciate having time, even on a webinar today, to sort of even bring up what we see in the courts. So I'll stop here, though. I'll pass the baton, because we'll get to some other stuff with the get tough approach on crime and where all that came from. So we're going to get there. I think that's in the other questions coming up.
Really great responses. Thank you.
Thanks. So I guess I'm going to go last, and I'm honored to. A lot of what my colleagues have discussed is an important component to what we are not talking about, I think, on a mainstream basis. And so I just have a couple of things to complement some of what has already been said. With my research, I'm a language-based theorist. I love to study plans and policies post-disaster. So I come at this from that perspective, and it kind of ties into a little bit of what Jason was talking about with our social construction, right? How are we talking about these things? And I always like to analyze plans and policies and reports looking for evidence of these social constructions, because I think a lot of what you guys are talking about with the manifestation of these systematic issues finds itself into these plans and policies. And if we can identify them and break them down, and I think that helps us move forward. So I premise my comments based on how I approach my research. And I think a lot of what we see is how we talk about people in these plans and policies. I analyze plans and they still talk about citizens. Okay. What about people who are not citizens, who need to be accounted for within your plans and policies moving forward? Being in Florida, we have a number of undocumented individuals, right? So if you limit some of your plans and policies to be only for citizens, what does that say to them, right? And what blinders are we putting on that could potentially impact the recovery from a disaster for those particular individuals? Victim versus survivor. Right? We talk about with Hurricane Katrina, how we talk about individuals. Are they a victim or are they a survivor? And we see in research over and over that how those individuals are defined can have direct implications to how much recovery money and recovery funding that they are receiving. Again, how we frame and how we talk about this is really, it has real policy impacts. And the last one, I love to study climate change, and it is not impacting everyone equally. We know that, especially for individuals who are in island states, as well as those who are already socially vulnerable. But we look at something like climate change refugees. Well, the first climate change refugees is in Ile-de-Jean-Charles, Louisiana, back where I'm from. And this is a very proud Indian tribe, and they don't see themselves as refugees. It's very insulting, actually, that you're calling them refugees. They were on that land in the 1830s, right? And now you're trying to relocate them. And we all know our American history about relocating Indian tribes. So even as we think about trying to help people, how we just talk about them and talk with them. And I think, I can continue on, but I think the last thing is, who is at the table? Who is at the table? And I think this is so important in emergency management, especially if we think about the whole community ideal, which is an ideal, it's not in reality yet. But as we think about it, who is at the table? And how can we move forward on that? So I'll pause there, because I know we have more questions to answer.
This is a really great discussion. But first of all, before going on to the next question, I was just curious if any of our panelists have a follow-up or a comment to your other panelists, or a question, anything that you would like to add. This would be a great opportunity to add that. Okay. guessing that's a no, but if not, you can just come back. Let's go ahead and go to this second question. This second question, I think, builds off of this first, and a couple of themes that we have noticed in here about the causes and effects of racism and white supremacy. There's everything from history, constitutional provisions, group dynamics, individual dynamics, agency dynamics, and so this next question is moving to this next stage, which is essentially this is putting into the chatter here. What needs to happen to make dismantling racism and white supremacy in emergency management and disaster preparedness a goal for governments in particular? Just feel free to answer in any order you would like.
If I can jump in and go
Sure,
first.
please do.
This ties into some of the things I was going to talk about. And I think that we need to look at the architecture of emergency management plans. This ties back into Dante's comments, Andre's comments, Antoine's comments, Henry's comments about you need to look at the historical foundation of emergency and crisis management. We need to reevaluate. Just think of it like an architecture, right? That there's walls, there's joists, there's rafters, there's a foundation, there's all these things that we are currently existing within this framework. And we're starting to question it, but we need to really systematically look at what are those pillars made of? What are those rafters made of? We need to figure out which ones need to be replaced, which ones need to be modified. But you're looking at things like recovery. So much of the funds are for homeowners, not for renters, not for those in public housing, right? And that, as Dante mentioned with his great presentation, really ties into long-term impacts for our individuals and our communities. Also, mitigation. Who selects the mitigation projects and where are they located? That needs to be systematically looked at, right? Because I don't think it's actually benefiting who it needs to benefit versus who has the higher property taxes or property values. And I like to just highlight Alessandra Jollerman's book that came out last year called Disaster Recovery Through the Lens of Justice. It's an excellent book. And her last chapter is Resilience for Whom, right? I think we need to look systematically at all the foundation of our field and understand and to really dive into what needs to be modified, what needs to be changed. I'll pause there. So.
Excellent.
I'll jump in. I agree with a lot of what's already been said, and the reason I have a lot of comments in reaction to what everyone has said, we just don't have the time for it. But like when we talk about, I absolutely agree that who is at the table at making these decisions or who contributes to making these decisions are fundamentally the base of where we need to go. The problem for me, and Claire, you and I have talked about this before, is this notion of we need, before we can even get to getting more people at the table, we have to have the powers that be, the decision makers that make the decision to bring in more people to that conversation, acknowledge the fact that they need to be there. So what Henry was talking about before, this notion that love versus fear, or this idea that we are, as a society, sadly enough, going more along these lines of reducing our morality or straying from morality is problematic. And for me, the notion of bringing people at the table devolves down to, or at least fundamentally, is this notion of cultural competence, right? Obviously, Claire, your new book, talking about this, how to train, and I'll talk about training people, and again, going back to this notion that Henry was talking about, changing decision makers' minds. It's fundamentally where we need to be. And if we cannot appeal to these people or have these people understand that from a moral standpoint, this is what is right, we need to frame it using political framing theory as a base. We need to pragmatically explain to people why having these people at the table is necessary, why it reduces mitigation, why it reduces social vulnerability, and talk about it in the sense where, like Dante was talking about wealth. Having these people at the table reduces community vulnerability and enhances resiliency, right? Well, that has immediate economic, social, and potential political effects for people that live there. And if we can explain that in that rational way to people that may question, well, why should I worry about the plight of minorities? Maybe they are deserving, or maybe they are not deserving. at the end of the day, it does not matter whether or not they're deserving, in my mind, or non-deserving if there is such a person that would be non-deserving. However, it does, regardless of whether or not they are or not, have immediate beneficial effects to the larger community when people are helped, when the EM starts to reduce the notion of who deserves or who is not deserving, or this, or we construct this narrative around, well, I, as the politician, save this community. No, there are immediate, rational, and direct physical or monetary effects that are both spillover and also latent. And so I definitely agree that the notion of who is at the table, and this has been something that we've talked about for many years. And nonprofits and this notion that we bring people at the table, or EM managers or EM planners are supposed to bring in various organizations to the planning table. Well, where is the oversight of that, right? The statutes say you have to bring them in. They don't say to what extent, how often. And many times when I've talked to, especially local nonprofit and faith-based organizations, they're never reached out to, or they say that they've never been asked to sit at the table to represent the people, their constituents that they are there to represent. And so I definitely agree that having more people at the table is important, but getting those decision makers to buy into the value of having more diversity and representative people at that table, I think is very difficult.
Fantastic response.
Yeah, I think you bring up some good points there, and I think that this definitely is a combination of things. It's leadership, it's community engagement, and it's accountability. I'm going to start with leadership really quick. Just some quick numbers. So when we look at emergency management, out of the 50 state emergency management directors, only 3 are people of color. Out of the emergency management accreditation programs, 13 commission leaders, only 1 is Hispanic, no Black, no Asian. Out of all of IEM USA 7 leaders, they're white, although predominantly female. Out of their global board, IEM's global board, they're all white, and those are the people that have voting members at the global level there. Out of the 88 directors of the North American Alliance of Hazard and Disaster Research Institutes, 18 are racial or ethnic minority, only 5 are Black, 4 are Hispanic. That's out of 88 different programs. Even out of the top 10 FEMA regional administrators, only 1 is of racial or ethnic minority. So I preface that by saying that leadership has to be representative of the populations that we serve. There's 40% racial ethnic minority in the United States. Even the female population is about half. I think maybe even a little bit more than males here, and that's not represented in these numbers in emergency management either. So that's a very good place to start right there. It's just diversifying representation of what it looks like. I think Dr. Rivera has a really good point about community engagement and having people at the table. That's been a common thing, that we do not have the community at the table. And the other thing is the community that are at the table, they don't listen to them. So you have to move further than just saying, oh, well, we gave them a seat at the table. You have to listen to them. And there has to be accountability. There's lack of evaluation of emergency management programs. There's lack of evaluation of emergency management policies. We have to start to look at those and assess them for vulnerability and equity. We have to be able to evaluate those, develop specific performance metrics and measures that say, you know what, this is equitable or it's not equitable. We have to start thinking about equity and transaction. How are the funds allocated? Who needs those funds the most, and how can it be most beneficial? I think that any approach that's adopted in emergency management has to be adopted vertically and horizontally. And that's where the challenge really lies. So it has to be top down from federal all the way down to local, and then it has to be bottom up, which means that they have to have the input of the local level and actually adhere to that at the federal level. But then also on the ground, there has to be a horizontal line of communication, whether that's within, the city mayor, the city managers, the emergency management, and there has to be better community engagement. If I was to ask everybody right now, who is the president, everybody could tell me who that is. If I was to say, well, who's your local emergency management, that number probably decreases significantly. So most people don't know their emergency manager. I can, go on record and say that maybe not on this call, but a lot of people don't even know who the administrator of FEMA is. So there has to be better engagement in emergency management to help, really dismantle this. And I think that when we look at community engagement and improving it, having that seat at the table, but listening and then being held accountable for doing so will really make a big difference. And I'll stop there.
Really interesting response. And just before we get to our next speaker, I want to say that we did receive some questions in advance, particularly about these federal versus local tensions. And so hopefully if we have some time for Q&A later, it'd be nice to revisit that point in particular. So I appreciate that.
Dante, do you want to go before? Okay, so this kind of dovetails into what Antoine just said. So I'm going to use myself as an example, right? So I'm a poor kid from the project from the South, and we use words like finna, right? So I grew up on the peripheral of society. I could have gone one or two ways because there were people in my life that invested in me and thought that I was worth investing in. I'm now helping cultivate other people and helping them in the beginning, the start of their career. I just want you to think about that process. So the first question that we talked about, why does racism and white supremacy exist, is because of that value statement that we have in our mind. So when we talk about added benefit, investing in communities that are marginalized, imagine the gifts that brown communities have given you, all versions and variations thereof, including indigenous people, and the gifts that females have given you without full notoriety in the United States. So that is the added benefit. If you ever find yourself in a room of, good old boy system that says, well, what's the value in that? They only make up 2% of our community. Well, think about the gifts that you've received from within those major groups that you're focused in on. Those same gifts, and sometimes intensified, can come from the smaller groups. So I know it's a struggle being in that room, but if you need an example, use my bald-headed self, right? I could be out doing much worse things in the world other than cultivating minds. And so I think when we invest in people, we will always see a return. If you invest in humans, it never fails. They will somehow show their appreciation through some outward expression. But when you neglect them, you will find crime increasing because people have base needs, right? They need to eat. Shouldn't be rocket science. So if you find yourself in that room where you can't make the value statement, use examples of people who have brought great joy to Americans because someone gave them an opportunity or saw the worth in them. And so I see the worth in these communities because no matter what city I'm in, I understand what those struggles are, whether I have a PhD or not. And I think we all have to get to that by using the examples of people that we adore, that we listen to on the radio. Maybe they're entertaining you in some way, or you just respect them. Well, imagine how many Oprahs we can pull out of Tennessee, right? If we saw the worth in Tennessee and the communities of color embedded in those smaller cities and townships. I want to add these 2 points and then I'm going to shut up. We have to be intentional in our hires. So it's not just enough to have representation and be at the table, but I will challenge supervisors to ask those tough questions. If we hire you, what will you do to contribute to dismantle white supremacy within our oppressive systems here at FEMA? Right? Ask those uncomfortable questions because you are in organizations that have, deep-rooted systems that if everyone on that team is not on the same sheet of music, those systems will overcome any individual effort that's being made within those organizations. So first, to the question of how do we dismantle it within governmental organizations and how do we embed that in our goals? Part of it is change your practices and be intentional in your hiring. And I know we've sort of sullied this concept of diversity hires and we've sullied it in a way. It's really reverse psychology. That's what it is. I don't mind being a diversity hire because I know when I come in there, I'm going to open the gate for other people behind me. So let's get rid of the idea that that's a negative thing, because if we continue with that and say we're only bringing in the talented 10, whatever that might be, are you assuming that brown of all shades and indigenous people and women can't be included in that talent pool? Simply putting a statement that we are trying to diversify our ranks, all are welcome, but we highly encourage those who are from marginalized communities. We've got to change our language around it, and we've got to be intentional. And we can't do it after the fact if we get a pool of 1 or 2 and say, oh, maybe we could capitalize 3 ways or 4 ways by bringing in a handicapped female, right? we have to think about it before we even put the call out. And this is in practice, this is in academia, this is in our daily walk in life. And the last thing, let's stop seeing radical change as something that's negative, right? It's necessary change. When we see that there's a problem that's been around for more than a decade, it's necessary change. Incrementalism is what causes us to get lazy. It causes us to not think, not to be innovative. And so when I put ideas out in a room full of people that I think are smart, and they go, oh yeah, you know, that's so big. Okay, well, why are we in the room, right? Why are we calling ourselves smart if we're not the thinking entity of society, right? So we do have to think big so that practitioners have something to work with. I'll leave it there. So just remember this point. We have sullied both radical change and we have sullied the concept of diversity hire. And I'm telling you to not fall into that psychology and be intentional with your advertisements. That's how you bring people in that are not just representative, but actually care about the communities, right? And be very direct with your questions when you are interviewing people. And that obviously means I'm assuming that we've already fixed you as the manager and the supervisor, right? And that now that you're having this interview with folks to bring them into the fold, that you're asking direct, poignant questions that make them uncomfortable. I'm going to mute myself.
Fantastic response. Thank you.
Dr. Smart, that is a hard one to follow, and so I'll try to keep the enthusiasm. And so what I'll just kind of offer in this segment of the questioning is that I piggyback off of all of what my colleagues have already mentioned. I think I'll maybe just give a quick example of something I've experienced. And so what needs to happen to dismantle racism and white supremacy in EM? So as a graduate student, I actually worked with a community in Virginia, a coastal community. And part of it was an exercise to think through how do we engage with local government, local emergency managers, and really understand how can we facilitate this idea of incorporating local knowledge into planning. And so as we kind of fielded this, we had these conversations, one of the things that they mentioned was that they've had over the past few years, it's been a recurring issue is that the way that the geography is situated is that they're on a coastal, kind of an isolated island, if you will. And so there's a segment on this island of folks that are predominantly, they live in trailers and they're low to moderate income, but they're the most vulnerable to sea level rise and recurrent flooding. And so what we see is that when there's tidal flooding, these communities are washed out or there's all this damage, they need help. And one of the things that was fielded or kind of asked in that group was, what is happening to include these people in local planning? And the top executive said nothing. Those were the quote unquote nothing. We are doing nothing. And no one in the room batted an eye, his colleagues. No one said that this doesn't make sense, right? It was a clear, and this is for me to make a judgment. I think that what we observed was that there was a clear disregard for folks in the community, right? If for someone who's a decision maker, who sits at a place of making decisions, has power, and ultimately is affecting the lives of those who are most vulnerable. And there was no regard for their lives, right? This idea around lived experience and needing to incorporate that into local planning, when folks are not willing to engage in this type of work, and there's just a willingness to disregard people's lived experience, but also know it's disgusting, right? And I think that when we think about dismantling racism, it's not just reformation or reforming something. We're talking about dismantling, meaning taking things apart, right? In my eyes, right, in order to do that, when we think about leadership, the emotional intelligence, right, I think that even in some ways, we don't have, when we think about recruiting folks in these really sensitive positions, the emotional intelligence that comes along with this, right? I don't even think that we teach managers emotional intelligence in PA. I don't know if folks have the sensitivities to really understand the depth of chattel slavery and how it's manifested throughout the years, right? And so when we think about what needs to happen, when I think about that one manager, I'm just like, this dude needs to go. But there are no power checks and balance for him to go because no one has questioned his authority. No one has challenged him in any way. But that's been the narrative of most folks who have been in power for a long time. No one needs to question them. We take what they say as final and absolute. but that's not the, but that's how we see these discrepancies or disparities manifest in emergency management. So I'll just kind of leave it there. And I think I'm the last one for this question. So.
Oh no, I gotta go too. Sorry, I actually forgot I was a
Sorry about
panelist.
that.
Oh, you're fine. I forgot I was a panelist because I was listening. So, and I'm going to deviate slightly because I can't tell you how much I appreciate all the comments and everything that my colleagues are saying today. But again, I come from the area dealing with the court systems and things like that. And so one of the things that I am actually presenting in my dissertation, one of the topics that, I'm really trying to bring this point to light is that, yes, there are so many, we have a long way to go. We do. We have a long way to go in that, we have to be more direct, about what it is that we are proposing to do when we talk about focusing, like, where to go? Dr. Henry Smart was talking about, investing in people, investing in the communities, and, having more conversation, as Antoine was saying as well, having more conversation about, how it is that we get people to truly focus on, wealth and things like that, right? So we have to change mindsets with people as well, and that comes not just from having one or two conversations or a Zoom meeting, right? That comes from, again, being intentional about things. And so one of the areas that I focus on more than anything, you'll always hear me preach about this, I don't think it's ever going anywhere, juveniles and youth diversion. And so keeping kids out of the court system, right? I have been preaching this for years, and finally, people are paying attention, and I'm glad to see that. But the fact of the matter is that we're talking about emergency management and preparedness. And the thing is, even in how we've been treating our juveniles in the court systems, it has never been equitable. And it's never been at a point where we're investing in them as humans. What we're actually doing is treating them just like a case number, and we're not focusing on their needs of the individual. We have not been doing that. This is all across the board, all around the globe. And there are some parts of the world, though, who have done these complete paradigm shifts in working with juveniles. Because the thing is, if we don't focus on the kids, right, we don't focus on the very things that are affecting them, we are not going to have those individuals who feel that they are good enough to apply for the positions that are typically held by people who look different than them. And so what I'm saying is that in terms of actually, like, with diversion, we have built this system around, having kids. You commit one crime, you're considered low risk and at risk and all these other terms people have thrown around, right? But the truth of the matter is, the color of your skin, somebody's skin color, or the area from which they come, if they're not considered white, or even in any of these other parts of the world, it's racism deeply rooted, and that we actually have kids coming through the system where they need to have people focusing on their risks, their needs. We need to know how responsive they will be to treatment if it's presented to them, but yet we focus on whether or not they committed a crime. And that's like the only thing we were thinking about in the court systems. Having conversations with many other criminologists and things like that, these are what we've been talking about. These are the laws that we have to change right now, even just in Illinois. These are our conversations right now in state government. And so that being said, and I feel like I'm, just pontificating on and on and on, but the point is, we have done a huge disservice to our people and our communities by not having these conversations sooner. And we also have gotten to the point, though, where we need to be focusing on what it really means to address a young person's risk factors, what it really means to address a young person's, the situations they're in, the multiple systems in which they can be re-victimized. We have to focus on those things. And again, these kids are the ones we're saying are our future, but yet we have not really ever invested in what that future could look like for them. So, one other thing I forgot to mention, with diversion in particular, again, we have taken kids, we put them in the system to make ourselves feel good, like we're changing things, like we're doing the right thing. But the truth of the matter is, we were actually subjecting them more to the service and to the court system, and widening the net a lot more than we ever should have. That's what's been happening.
So
I'll pause there.
No, these are fantastic comments. And in order to build off of that, we do have a third question to ask. And I was wondering if we could ask Dr. Clara Connolly Knox to go first, because I know that you have to leave in about 5 minutes for a meeting. But it nicely build off this conversation. We have our third question. What is a promising strategy to dismantle racism and white supremacy in emergency management and disaster preparedness? So Dr. Clara Connolly Knox, would you like to lead us off?
Sure, thank you. And thank you again for allowing, for inviting me and to be a part of this amazing panel and this very important conversation. I think there's a number of strategies, and I'm encouraging, I'm curious to see what my other colleagues say, because we're all coming at it from very different perspectives, and I think that's what's needed. From my perspective, I say that in continuing research, asking questions that need to be asked, to do a systematic analysis of our existing plans and policies, such as what Antoine was talking about, to provide that foundation of, hey, here's where we're at, and then to be able to then make strategic goals, measurable objectives to move the needle forward. It's a very public administration way of thinking about it, but that's how I would approach a potential strategy.
Excellent. Thank you.
And I'll piggyback a little bit on what Dr. Knox was just saying too. Yeah, I agree. We have got to do a better job of this in terms of research. And again, I was mentioning diversion, and it's pretty embarrassing to say this, but in terms of diversion, you really can't do systematic analyses on these because they're so different, and then none of them are the same. The information is not generalizable. There has to be more research. You can't even take 5 programs and do an analysis on them. You can't even do it. So that's the problem. So yeah, there has to be more research. I totally agree.
Excellent. Thank you. Don't be shy, panelists.
I guess I'll continue with this notion of research. So one of the things that I think is exceedingly necessary in this whole idea of enhancing our knowledge of what the value is and what the challenges are around this area within EM, but quite honestly, across all policy spectrums, goes back to what Antoine had said before, right? This perception of the presence of white supremacy and white racism in EM. And and some of the things Dontá said at the very beginning, when he was talking about wealth and at what level wealth is being analyzed. One of the things that I've mentioned, and one of the things that when I look at as a methodologist, one of the problems that we have when we're making inferences and we're making generalizations and we're talking about what affects who and what, is there are a lot of ecological fallacies, or at least the potential for ecological fallacies, when we talk about data and what the data means. And I say that simply because we have, and based on what a number of people on this panel have said about everything is compared to whites, right? Well, the reason is because that is the most accessible data we have. I don't know how many of you have attempted to get individual data on disaster aid recipients from FEMA, but it is a hell trying to get it, if you can get it at all. And so the ability to look at what affects who, or the equity, or the equity of disaster aid allocation is done at a county level. And then we make these assumptions that these county level inferences are applicable to the individual level. And many times, and there are very few studies that have looked into this because of the availability of data, they typically don't carry forward. The inferences are not the same at the individual level, or vice versa. So one of the things going along the research mind is attempting to try to get data more accessible to people that can make those assessments and do the statistical analysis of yes or no, this is equitable, this is being distributed equitably or not. The other thing that, and I've talked about this in a more general sense, is we talked a great deal about this notion of social equity, right? Antoine, again, pointed out that there's a lack of language, not only in EM, PA in general. We talk about social equity, but, and Sean, you opened up with with a quote from Susan Gooden, but this notion of what is social equity? When we put, or I would argue that the reason we do not have the language or the phrase social equity in a lot of things is because it means too many different things to too many different people. And it is a way to interpretive, here, I cannot say words, interpretive, whatever. You guys get what I'm saying. for a number of people to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. My argument, and I've talked about this, and I saw Tia Gaynor around, and I've talked about this with Tia and a few others, is this notion that instead of looking at the long goal of social equity, which we all want, the more accomplishable goal is ingraining social justice into our policies, our programs, and our actions. Justice, if it's about fairness, can be measured and can be said, there, that is fair. This is not fair, as opposed to a more general notion of what is equitable or not equitable, which can be a composite of social justice in addition to a number of other indicators. And so, but we also, and one of the things I wanted to say was that Henry's notion of being very intentional about hires goes to that. Social equity is not just a byproduct of representative bureaucracy, right? Just hiring someone that looks like me or looks like someone else does not accomplish the goal of getting things done, right? You can hire someone that is from the Latino community, but they may not give may not care about helping those that are less off than them or less or poorer than them. So the intentionality in asking what Henry said of asking those questions, or being allowed to ask the question of, if we hire you, and not in a malicious way, or I got you, you're not getting a job, but are you going to help these communities to enhance mitigation, to enhance resiliency, to reduce vulnerability into the future? Or are you just here to fill a seat? I'll let other people go.
Great response. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you have some really good points there, Dr. Rivera. And I want to follow up on that just a little bit and just say that we have to understand that disasters will happen. We all know that. But the thing that we don't often say is that vulnerability is exacerbated by disasters, which means that it was pre-existing, it was there, and that disasters will make it worse. And the more that vulnerability exists, the worse the disaster outcome will be. So, are emergency managers at fault for doing their job when they're managing a disaster the best way they know how? Not at all. They're doing their job. But is there room for improvement? Absolutely. And as emergency managers, a lot of times we focus on operations. There's full plans for it. There's hazard mitigation plans. There's standard operating procedures. There's ICS. There's response frameworks. All of these things that focus on operations. And we have to begin to operationalize equity as well. We have to make sure that we build equity within those operation plans and that it becomes just as much of a system as NIMS is, or as ICS is, or as our hazard mitigation plan is. These issues, again, are pre-existing, which means that they're around prior to disaster. And if you've worked in EM, you may know Ellis Stanley, who is the Chief Transformation Officer of IDEM, but he's a 45-year emergency manager for City of LA and Atlanta, but he always says that you need to plan in blue sky days. And what that means is that we can't wait till a disaster strikes and says, hey, by the way, don't forget about Black, Indigenous people of color. We have to start to focus on that when the sky is blue. We have to build those relationships in the community when the sky is blue. We have to have these people at the table when the sky is blue. That gray sky and those impending, that flood water coming in, that's not the right time to do it. And that's not the right time to consider it either. And saying that, hey, when we respond, we have to do this, because then you don't have the resources to handle that. You have to be proactive about this. You have to be intentional. We've used that word a lot, and I like the word intentional. We have to be intentional about it. And we have to do this on our blue sky days. We have to have that established prior to disasters. And also in lines with research, we have to start to bridge research and practice. There's a lot of research on vulnerability and race and all of those things, but it doesn't translate to practice well. Part of that is you can't expect an emergency manager to read a 30-page report. It's beyond their scope of practice. But if you can, write that in a way that is beneficial, then that does help. So there are ways that we have to start to bridge those things, case studies and after action reports, the way that we teach. And I'm mad Dr. Knox jumped off, but she has a lot about teaching, specific cases on how we can include that ahead of time. But I think that we have to start to do that. The other thing I think we really need to focus on, and because this is kind of public administration, is that I don't really recall any mayors or, politicians that say, hey, I was an emergency manager before this. Most of them were lawyers or, operated in any other field other than emergency management. Again, in public health, we have health lawyers. Real estate has real estate lawyers. And all of these lawyers come in and they review policies, they analyze these different things, but emergency management doesn't have that. So one of the things that I think we need to start to look at doing is expanding how we operate in emergency management. People are getting doctoral degrees in emergency management now. They're getting masters in it. They're getting bachelors in it. So the field is growing. And in that growth, we have to have more of a stance in how we approach it from a policy standpoint, whether it's emergency management law or things that can really expand the field to make sure that we grow in a good place. The one thing I will say, because I'm an optimistic spirit, is that emergency management is still a young field. It's still a baby. So there is a lot of room right now to take these opportunities and these conversations and start to make a positive change in it to improve disaster outcomes, because we know disasters are only going to get worse in the future. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Wonderful response.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
can't.
so I just kind of,
No, go ahead then.
sorry about that. Jason, did you already go? Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'll just add really quickly. So one of the things that I think about when we think about kind of what's a promising strategy, I think about from the research side of how we can incorporate more decolonizing methodologies in public administration. And so seemingly there have been conversations around these public special issues with like PAR and public integrity, right? Where we're intentionally trying to understand how can we take a more critical lens to our work. And so while we've done work on in the public administration on admin and management, you know, organizational theory, theories of change, not necessarily thinking about how race and impacts these interactions from the very beginning, right? And so really taking a socio-historical approach to this work. And so one of the things around, for example, critical race theory, right? We haven't seen a lot around critical race theory, critical theory, indigenous theories, right? These theories help us to really understand these racial lenses that we're trying to approach and really interrogate and think about what are these power structures that are in play. One of the things about, and I think that calling out white supremacy is that, you know, a lot of things happen in the details, right? A lot of things happen in subtle ways. And so when we think about dismantling, we have to take apart the whole thing. We have to call a thing a thing. And so even in small, subtle ways where we see racism and white supremacy creep up and manifest, we have to have a way to frame that and call it out. We have to have a way to analyze and really understand, okay, what does it mean to tell a counter narrative to status quo, right? And I think that as we think about in public administration, those who are, you know, interested in moving this work forward, we have to decolonize the way that we thought about things in public administration. I mean, when I think about my first public admin class in my master's program, I saw no people of color, right? When I look at the classics and when I understand the field of public administration, I've never really seen much of people of color, right? I think that in my own journey, I've been able to meet colleagues and folks who have been able to really expose me. But when I think about in the actual classroom, and I'll move on to teaching, part of what I think we can do in dismantling a lot of this work is moving beyond peer-reviewed publications as a way to verify and validate what's out there, right? There's a lot of gray literature, a lot of white literature that really that looked at a lot of these things that academics don't in some ways. And for those who are academics, right, using people of color, authors who are people of color or from historically marginalized backgrounds, using that in your syllabus to teach your work, right? And explicitly stating, hey, I pull from this pool of resources as I teach, and this is the lens that I come from, right? I don't necessarily know if we've done a lot of that. I know that at least in my public admin experience, it hasn't happened much, unless it was an elective course that I took outside of my department. And so those were the folks there, and I thought like, oh my God, this stuff is super radical. Which in actuality, public admin just hadn't gotten that far just yet, right? And so having these conversations and being just a little bit more robust and thinking about what are those decolonizing methods, what are those critical methodologies that we could use on the research side, and then on the teaching side, how can we use that in the classroom? From a practice side, I see this really as a way of, you know, bridging that practitioner and academic gap. You know, we think about policy briefs and we think about all these other things, but I think that part of it is that there has to be a willingness on both sides to really communicate. And so I think our agendas also have to bubble up from the community and not just chasing the dollar in academia. And so thinking about what are the true needs. I think we have emergency managers on the call. You know, do we field our questions from there? Or are we fielding it just from the literature or the gaps? Because there are a whole bunch of gaps in the literature. there's so many gaps that I think that we could have a million other PhDs do research on this stuff and still not figure out everything, right? But I think the intentionality behind it really matters. So I'll leave it there.
So I'll just follow up the academic piece, but I'm going to shift most of what I have to say for practitioners. We really have to diversify the editors for our predominant journals. I put a CRT piece out. It sat for 5 months. They had 2 good reviews and one said, I don't know what this is. And they said, okay, no, thank you. So we are purposely discouraging progress. So now I'm pushing that to another field because I know they'll accept the work. But we have got to have a conversation about critical race theory in public administration. Our idea of a race study is including a race variable. So that means we've got to first educate our community that we have not criticized race in a real way so that we can prevent some of these poor outcomes that we've seen since 1964. We've seen no improvement, by the way. Housing, employment, people are getting higher forms of education, but we are literally at a stasis in terms of communities of color. So I just want to point that blaring fact out there that we've done a lot in terms of litigious nature and activity, but nothing's really changed because the folks that are guarding the gates of what is getting out there in terms of knowledge do not look like or represent the totality of America. So I'm going to get off academia for a minute, and there goes my career. In terms of practitioners, I'm going to just pass on these 4 things. Make good enemies, right? You're going to rub some people the wrong way, but make sure you deliver what you have to say in a respectful manner so that 6 months you'll be friends again. Increase collaboration across social sciences and hard sciences. We see this happening in organizations like Bill Anderson Foundation, which I'm a recipient of that fellowship. Embrace intersectionality. And what I mean by that is, and I think, Antoine, you touched on this a bit. So if you're doing an intake form of who needs to get emergency funds from FEMA, look at that form and see if it determines further than just whether the family has an income threshold that qualifies them. Look to see if the head of the household is disabled. Look to see if the head of the household is female. Look to see if the head of the household has any other condition or status that may further complicate their life before the disaster even occurs. And put that into a calculus. Since we all love numbers so much, use that calculus. Because what that calculus does is it embraces and it operationalizes social equity. And the reason why the social equity discussion hasn't gone far enough is because we've not had that practice implementation of it. Like, what does it look like in the field? We're still talking about it as a concept. We need to actually implement it in terms of how we dole out services in times of distress. Use your IG departments. Make sure that your IG, team or shop has an equity goal, meaning that they're going to now look at pre-post conditions and how services were relayed during times of stress and during times when it's peace, right? But make sure they're actually telling that narrative, because they're as close as we're going to get in terms of other folks accessing that knowledge and information. So at the beginning of the year, let them set a goal that they're going to look at equity, how services were fairly applied to a disaster, and what existed before the disaster, and how are you managing afterwards, right? So that pre-post mitigation, the whole 9 yards. Have the IGs of these local governments start doing that work and being on top of telling the story that we can't get access to the information, right? We know they can, but have that discussion with your IG shops. I like what Mr. Rivera said here. Social justice should be the goal. And so thank you for that. It gets us out of the rut of talking about and trying to figure out where social equity should land, right? It's the hottest term, I think, in public administration right now. But let's use social equity as a means to the end, right? It is not necessarily, if you set it as a goal, you're going to have problems, because it's really something that you should put to practice and not make it necessarily the primary goal. If you make social justice the primary goal, no one gets left out, right? Create learning and action communities who collaborate beyond their respective fields. So this can't just be a conversation around emergency managers, right? pick up the phone and call one of your local professors. Pick up the phone and call a local lawyer and determine what criminality looks like in a time of disaster, right? Start having these conversations across the board. I know in certain communities, especially throughout the state of Ohio, it's happening, right? But we have to do this throughout the United States. And then lastly, hire more intentional dismantlers, right? And make sure that they're women, right? Let's even this out. Because if we know that women make up 50% of society, what does your EM team needs to look like? All right, let's be real. Know your local statistics on these groups and try your best to have your organization mirror your society, your local society, your small microcosm of society. And make sure that they're some shade of brown, right? Be intentional about it. So to me, that's your playbook. If we at least get these things started throughout the U.S., I think you'll start to see this change. And more importantly, support organizations that create pipelines from academia in attempts to diversify the EM field, like Bill Anderson Fund. I'm going to plug them again. So support those organizations.
Professor Rogers, you had a follow-up, I believe.
Yes. I sometimes I forget to unmute and I just get to listening and it's great. But so one of the things that I wanted to definitely make sure to talk about, because again, I've been talking about diversion this whole time. So that's why I appreciate Dr. Smart, what you were just saying, because we do have to make sure it is more than just about EM, right? Everything in a way is actually tied to the way in which we carry out EM. And so I'm also thinking about, again, just with diversion. So one of the things that I forgot to mention earlier is how diversion was even created. It was basically created from white Europeans who wanted to control Black and brown kids who were not working at the time. And so, they were truant from school a lot because they were having to work or stay home, help take care of kids, whatever, And so in the process, and this has been since the 70s. And so here we are now in 2020, and we still haven't figured this out, not in PA, not in criminal justice. We haven't gotten this together. And so this is the reason why, again, with my dissertation that I'm writing at the moment, I'm trying to make sure to bring this issue to light, because it is a moment of actually having a better understanding of what social justice means, how we actually bring these things to light. And I know that in terms of diversion from a public administration standpoint, again, not being able to actually see what makes this program a little better than that program, why this one has better results than that, we suck at that. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna say it. We have not done a great job with this. And so in terms of trying to bridge this policy practice gap, I'll tell you now, as a criminologist and even as a person in PA, I'm not reading 722 pages either. And I work with legislation, and I'm going to also tell you, we have enough time to have a one-page fact sheet, and that's all we got. And the difficulty has been trying to understand what people in academia have been saying all along. This is not new information. It's just, you can say it in fewer words. So that's basically, I'm just going to be real, but that's basically where we're getting to in terms of how to really start changing some of these systems. And so I appreciate very much what everybody has been saying today. I've learned so much as well. But I know that in terms of actually dismantling a lot of the white supremacist, mindsets and systems that we have perpetuated over the decades, we still have a long way to go. You will never hear me stop talking about diversion. That's something that I'm always going to bring up, because there are ways to keep kids out of prison without recriminalizing things, or at least reintroducing them to other aspects of crime, widening the net, and then doing nothing to really see any kind of change. We're not seeing behavior change, and there's a reason why we're not. We were never focusing on the young person to begin with. We were focusing on ways to make ourselves feel good as the adults in control, if you will. So that's the only other thing I wanted to add.
Well, that's a fantastic thing. And one of the great things about these panels is that each of the panelists, each of you come from such different but also similar ways. It leads to such a powerful, wide-ranging discussion. I'd like to draw everyone's attention really quickly. Dr. Tia Gaynor is also with us, as a few people have noted, and Dr. Gaynor, Dr. Plesset, and Dr. Fudge did some work on defining social equity. If you look at page 11, particularly on that PDF file we sent, I think that'll help contextualize some of this discussion. And I'd also would like to give a shout out to the Bill Anderson Fund as well. Dr. Monica Sanders was supposed to be with us today. She's the director of that fund, couldn't make it, but this webinar would not have happened without quite frankly, the awesomeness of the Bill Anderson Fund and also Dr. Sanders. So can't recommend that program enough. We earlier shared a link for you to basically ask questions and comments. We received a few in advance. We only have 9 minutes left, but we're going to try to get through some. I'd like to ask one of the questions that was asked on the form. I'm going to be typing it in the chat right now. And its question is this: can the FEMA mitigation program be a way to facilitate the dismantling by including some of the disparities into risk calculations and set mitigation priorities? It'd take a moment or two to let that sink in, and just any of our panelists who want to address that.
The short answer is yes, but I'll allow others to chime in here.
Yeah, I think the answer for that one is definitely a yes. What I think it's going to take is actually an investment into it, though. So there have been a lot of, there's a lot of potential with FEMA. There's a lot of programs and things there that are out that could definitely achieve the goal that we want to achieve. But implementing them and evaluating them has always been a bit of an issue. So even when we look at the whole community approach, it's a very good approach. I mean, you're looking at the community level, really kind of, that horizontal and that vertical approach to emergency management and including the community, public industry, private industry, and things like that. Phenomenal approach, but it's not well implemented. And we haven't heard about it being implemented well. We haven't heard about it being evaluated. In public health, when we get programs like that, we implement them, we evaluate them, and then eventually down the line, we say, here's an evidence-based strategy. This is guaranteed to work in this situation. And I think that FEMA has not done a good job of implementing their ideas in a way that can really achieve what they need them to achieve. And it's also, part of that is also politics. FEMA has bounced back and forth a lot. Civil defense and terrorism kind of getting swept under Homeland Security, funding over here for disasters, funding taken away. So it's really difficult for them to do that. And then historically, it's been a response and recovery agency and not so much prevention and mitigation agency. So again, it's going to take them saying that we really need to allocate these fundings more towards mitigation or resilience or something else, and actually implementing those a bit better for them to be effective.
I personally don't ever see FEMA being that explicit around racism and white supremacy, although I think that could be a thing. I think that when we think about some of the research around just the importance of FEMA funding and just how it has caused some inequities, obviously, I think that if there's funding and mitigation, I think that we've seen the research around the investment in mitigation. There's some assumption that it saves us money on the back end when we think about recovery, right? But the reality of it is that to be intentional about dismantling racism means that you have to talk about racism, right? And so that has to be embedded into the content of how you orient folks to those programs and training folks, right? Where I kind of see this getting lost is that folks aren't comfortable with having those conversations, and then that progress gets stifled, right? And so that's kind of like some preliminary insights around how I think about, can that be a way or mechanism to dismantle racism? Absolutely. The way in which it's done, because we're thinking about investing with finance. And so financial capital happens to be one of those capitals that most people of color or marginalized communities don't have access to. So the more that there is, sure, but the distribution of that and then the actual acknowledgement of these socio-historical contexts really matter, because if not, then there's money put into a program, and then we say, okay, let's try to evaluate it in 5 years. Well, we have to be intentional up front. If the true intention is to have a quality of life improvement for folks who are Black and brown, then say that, right? And actually follow up with it. And I think those are the things that would require a lot more massaging over with FEMA.
I think there's also a second layer to this is not your average person may not be fully aware of a pre-mitigation program or how to apply for it. And there's not this concerted effort, knocking door to door to educate communities. So a lot of things I think would need to change in order for this to be one avenue to reach certain communities.
Yeah, I think definitely having FEMA use these metrics as a way to prioritize applications coming in for funds for mitigation projects is the one side, right? But that is a perfect point, right? On the other end, we need to enhance the capacity of grant writers or the localities that are sponsoring the grant writers, or the municipalities or the organizations that are trying to apply for the funds to create mitigation projects. Because like any other thing in community development, some of the agencies that are trying to engage in this work don't necessarily have the capacity that are looking after these minority communities to write these grants, to look for this money, or have knowledge that these grants are even available. And so I definitely agree. Yes, the answer is yes, like everyone else has said, but I think there's the two-pronged approach to, we also have to increase capacity on the other end. Yes, FEMA has the issues, but they can only do so much, even if they had the perfect situation as well.
And I'll piggyback on the point that Dr. Rivera was just making, even just about the grant writing aspect. In many of the grant applications that are available, lots of the RFPs that go out, you're absolutely right in that there have just not been very many great applications. When we review them, there just haven't been very many that are pretty good, or even worth funding, just based on how they're written. So, I mean, if they actually had people to assist them, whether it's trainings that are put out at the government level, or whether it's, local community-based training, whatever it needs to be, there just needs to be more of that. And again, you hear a lot of the comments and feedback from the communities. They say, well, we don't have anybody to teach us, or they'll say it's too expensive to find an actual grant writer. Or you'll have the agencies themselves that are applying. They will say things like, we can't fund a position for a grant writer right now. We just can't. Everything is tight. And so that's what we hear a lot. So you're absolutely right about that part.
Any other comments? Okay. Well, we have 3 minutes left, and it's a big question. I promised a few people who had asked a version of this question to ask this, and we'll just end it with this question. It's this. Can you speak to what you're seeing about how global climate change is related to racism and white supremacy, and even vice versa? Big question.
I'll jump in really quickly, and I also have to jump on another call too. But so my colleagues and I, we created something here called the Global Restorative Justice Partnership. And this really came in as a result of seeing the whole world mobilize after the George Floyd case and everything that was going down in the court systems, and the lack of responses from necessary individuals that you think would respond. So there's, I think, in terms of dismantling the white supremacists in this different systems that we are all witnessing and being a part of, yes, there's tons of movement, but as to the point of everybody on this call today, it's gonna really be a really critical decision that's gonna have to be made from the top down. And the ones at the top, they need to have a better understanding about how to carry out a lot of these duties, making sure you do have representatives from different kinds of agencies, the community, even students. You need to make sure that you have, them represented on your boards, committees, councils, task forces, whatever it's going to be. It can't just be the elected officials and then nobody else. So yes, there's still a lot of work to do, but that's where we need to start.
Thank you. Any of our other panelists?
I would honestly say something that was echoed earlier, and I didn't write who said it down, so I'll just say I remember someone on the panel talking about this notion of going back to this idea that we have to remember that or acknowledge that everyone is worth saving, right? I think to a certain extent, EM, but societies in general have operated off this notion that we do have societies that are worth sacrificing. And I think that is detrimental. And these communities that are typically worth sacrificing typically are communities of color, predominantly poor communities of color. And so I think, and with climate change as a whole, being able to deal with these communities that are affected by climate change, particularly sea level rise, and having these eco-refugees, and as they're called in the literature, trying to dispel or mitigate the influence of forced migration because of natural occurrences. Not to say anything of man-made disasters. I think a lot of what we've talked about today has been, I think, talking about FEMA and this notion of natural disasters or natural occurrences. What we're not or haven't talked about is really the effects of man-made disasters or tech disasters that, again, have these broad effects on communities of color, especially when you look at environmental justice issues, right? And so how does climate change more generally affect or the racism within that field? I think it is, I think to a certain extent it is heightened because, again, just as a byproduct of housing that we've talked, that has been explained throughout this panel several times, the byproducts of redlining, the byproducts of segregation are still rampant today. And most communities, a lot of communities of color are still situated in high hazard areas as a byproduct of being undesirable areas that more affluent whites did not want to develop. I'll leave it there.
Good comments. Any of our other panelists like to weigh in on this question? I see that Dr. Council has also shared a very useful link right there. So thank you, Dr. Council.
Yep, I'll just add that in the simple and a kind of a simple response is yes. And I just added an article that I think kind of highlights this kind of racial formation when we think about coastal communities, and we always think about the physical vulnerability and this kind of how physical vulnerability and social vulnerability kind of coalesce in this kind of larger discourse around climate change. And so I just offered that article as something that folks may be interested in.
We appreciate that. Thank you. Any of our other panelists? Well, okay, that's a wrap. So I'd just like to thank everyone who attended. I really would like to give a particular shout out to Dr. Brandy Blessed of the DSJ board, as well as Praxis Matters, for their help in getting this webinar set up today. And thank you to our amazing panelists, Dr. Council, Dr. Knox, Senior Advisor Richards, Dr. Rivera, Professor Rogers, and Dr. Smart III. We hope to have a recording of this event posted soon after review by the panelists. Again, we'd like to remind each of you are welcome and encouraged to submit papers to our Sections 2 sponsored special issues and journals we shared earlier. And I'd also like to emphasize that this series is not ending with this episode. This is the last of the year, not of the episode. And we're going to be back again next year with more topics in this series. And as we end all of our webinars, let's all remember it's our common duty, whether it's individuals or work in the field and more, to dismantle racism and white supremacy and create just systems. And when we do that, we ensure that public service lives up to its highest mandate, to improve people's lives. And this is what this whole series is about. So thank you all and stay safe. Bye, everyone.